What a bullshit video title, you might think. So let me tell you what this is about. First of all, how does a clamp actually work, and why, for example, can this here clamp much harder than this here? Now, asking the question how a clamp actually works might seem a little stupid, because it's that easy, but what does actually happen inside the clamp? So when you tighten a clamp, you actually reduce the distance between the clamping pads to less than the thickness of the workpiece. But of course the workpiece is still there, so where is this change in distance going? I can try to squeeze the workpiece into the tightened clamp, and to be able to do that I have to push the jaws outwards. And that's exactly what happens. The jaws get pushed outwards. Let's pretend the jaws are absolutely stiff, and when they get pushed outwards they tilt in this and this direction. And what does the bar do? It has to follow that motion because it's attached to the jaws. And what happens to the bar is it will get bent. That's a lot easier to visualize on a longer clamp. You see the bent bar. But in principle that's also the same that happens to this short section of the bar. You just can't see it because it's such a small amount. And the bar is what does the actual clamping, because it is manufactured straight and it wants to stay straight. If you force it into a bent shape, it wants to force itself back into a straight shape. And when you have a bent bar that wants to bend back, it also wants to move the jaws back into this position. And that's where the clamping force comes from. The amount of clamping force you can produce is of course how much you can change the distance between the pads, and that is equal to how hard you can turn on the handle. And how much you can turn the handles, or how hard you can turn them, depends on several things. First of all, it's the pitch of the thread. Actually, you can see on the smaller clamp, the pitch is lower than on the bigger clamp. A low pitch means when I move both handles half a turn, the one with the lower pitch will have moved less in this direction, and the one with the higher pitch will have moved more in this direction. A low pitch requires less torque because of that. All the force I use to turn this half a turn only moves the pad by, let's say, 1 millimeter. And on this here, the same force moves the pad 2 millimeters. More distance change means bending the bar more, and that's more difficult to do. So with just knowing that, the smaller clamp with the higher pitch should clamp harder, or should be easier to clamp harder than the big clamp with the higher pitch. But why isn't that the case? One factor is material quality and manufacturing quality of the threads. On this one I guess it's just better. But one big factor is the swivel pad. On the end of the threaded rod you can see there's a small shoulder, and that presses onto the swivel pad. On the big clamp the end has a ball shape and a matching shape in the swivel pad, and this really can swivel in every direction. So all the torque you apply on the handle has to overcome the bending of the bar, the friction of the threads in the nut, and the friction between the shoulder here and the swivel pad. Ideally, you want to have all the force from the torque into bending the bar. But that's not the case, because the more you tighten a clamp, more difficult it gets to overcome the forces of bending the bar and overcoming that friction. We can't do anything about the bar, because that's what we want, but we can do something about the friction. And that's the simple trick of this video, because all it comes down to is lubrication between the shoulder end of the threaded rod and the clamping pad, and lubrication in the threads. Because the more you tighten a clamp, it gets harder to bend the bar, but it's easier now to overcome that friction because of the lubrication. Very simple stuff actually. You can also hear the difference. This is a clamping pad of a clamp that I haven't lubricated in a while. And this is from the one that I just lubricated. You barely can't hear anything there. Most of the time this doesn't really matter, because you have this kind of force and torque in your hand to clamp enough, but sometimes you are in a weird position and can't really grab the handle properly, and then a properly working clamp is just saving the project and is much more enjoyable. Alright, and now after this really simple trick, still the question, after this has been lubricated, why can the bigger clamp still clamp a lot harder? The ball-shaped end with the swivel pad is just a lot better because the surface area is much bigger than the shoulder on the other clamp, and it's lubricated much better from the factory, and the lubrication can't come out as easily as on the other clamp. And the other part is the big part, which is the handle. It has a much bigger handle, and with a big handle you can just transfer a lot more torque. Simple example, small piece of shaft, one hand turns in this direction, the other in the other direction. No matter how hard you tighten your hands, one of them will slip. Big wooden dowel, same example. Before one hand slips, you will hurt yourself. Just because of a bigger handle, a lot more torque can be transferred. And the reason why the bars on bigger clamps are a lot bigger, most important is the range of the jaw, because the more range it has, the easier it gets to bend the bar, so it has to be bigger to be more difficult to bend. And the other thing is, because you can transfer so much more torque and force through a bigger handle and a good swivel pad, if it was just a small bar, you would bend it too much and destroy the clamp. Every component has to be made to handle all the loads and forces that go on here. And that was a little bit about how a clamp really works. Maybe you got something out of that, but you now should all go into your workshops and lubricate your clamps if you haven't done already.